Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to this session of the Jean Blondel Tuesday seminars. Today, we have the pleasure to have with us Luca Carrieri. Luca is a postdoc at LUISS University in Rome. He's an expert of voting behavior and he has published extensively. He collaborates with the CISE, Centro Italiano Studi Elettorali. And today he is presenting his latest book, which was published for Palgrave Macmillan in a series, Palgrave Studies in European Union Politics. And the book is entitled The Impact of European Integration on West European Politics. It's a book that analyzes the way European integration has become a contested concept in the party systems of the European member states and how this has shaped the electoral strategies of the parties. So we're very eager to listen from Luca the main findings and the contribution of his book. And so I'm happy to give you the floor, Luca. You have more or less 40-45 minutes for a presentation, and then we will have a Q&A. So welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mattia, and thank you to the entire department for the invitation. It's a pleasure to present my research. So, good morning to everyone. I'm going to present my newly published book with Palgrave Macmillan. So let me start with the research question of the book. So in the aftermath of the multiple set of crises, how much has the European integration conflict reshaped the electoral supply and party preferences in the national party systems? Let's start from a literature background, from a very short literature review on these topics. So we know that the European Union issues had historically a weak impact on the format and mechanics of domestic party systems. In spite of many expectations from scholars, the Maastricht Treaty did not really catalyze a growing politicization of this conflict. So the EU politicization hypothesis found only a mixed empirical backing in the aftermath of the Maastricht Treaty approval. However, scholars identified a shift in the public opinion attitudes towards the European Union. So this shift has been defined as a shift from a permissive consensus towards a constraining dissent. While the public attitudes toward the European Union have become more critical, and the authority transfers toward European institutions is creating more controversial, has created more controversiality in the last 20 years. So, in a nutshell, literature say that there was a growing polarization and structuration of public opinion attitudes towards the European Union issues. But nonetheless, this was coupled by a lacking party entrepreneurship on the European Union issues. So parties did not really emphasize those issues into the debate. In doing so, they prevented the European Union issues to be translated into voting preferences at the elections. And the impact of the European Union issues on voting choices had remained weak for decades. So in this book, I basically hypothesize a catalyst effects from a multiple set of crises. We know we had three major shocks in the last decade before the pandemic crisis, of course, which were the Euro crisis, the refugee crisis, and the Brexit referendum. So the Euro crisis held some transformative effects because the European Union took a central stage in handling the crisis. tightening fiscal and budgetary constraints of the member states. In this situation, citizens were increasingly able to held the European Union institution as responsible for the worsening of the economic situation, increasingly assigned the blame towards the European Union institutions. Nonetheless, another dichotomy came into being among the member states. Let's say an interstate conflict between the intervene or debtor countries and non-intervene or creditor countries. I know this distinction is very controversial, but we will have time to discuss this in the aftermath. So on the one hand, there were the weakest Eurozone economies, which suffered from the spillover effect of the Greek crisis and had to receive rescue packages under strict conditionality, or committed themselves to adopt austerity policies under the impetus of the European Union institution, especially the European Commission. On the other hand, we have the non-intervene countries. Those countries were able to recover rapidly from the economic crisis, but nonetheless, they were involved in the debate over the European Union management of the crisis by endorsing rescue packages for debtor countries. These rescue packages created a lot of controversiality in countries such as Germany or the Netherlands, and also reinforced some radical ordo-liberal ideologies, with many citizens opposing the economic embodiment of the Eurozone. So, in spite of their different economic grievances, citizens in both the country groups have been united in their political resentments towards the European Union. So my argument and my hypothesis here is that in spite of their difference, the Euro crisis catalyzed more homogeneity between those country groups. And both country groups experience a growing politicization of the European Union conflict. So also the migration crisis and Brexit held a transformative effect. So firstly, the migration crisis placed further stress on the European Union governance. And since then, the European Union has been unable to come up with a coordinated response toward the crisis, spurring a political division on interstate cooperation. Furthermore, the Brexit referendum had also produced an Eurosceptic momentum across the continent. Though many scholars have discussed whether this was or was not an Eurosceptic momentum, the Brexit clearly was a window of attention for the European integration process, or we can say for European disintegration moment. One of my ambitions in this work is to decouple the notion of European Union politicization. So the notion of politicization was basically aimed at covering the supply side of politicization. The unit of analysis have constantly been political parties, or in many other cases, interest groups, but nonetheless, elite groups. Many works in political science have identified the main compounding elements of the politicization notion as the issue saliency and positional polarization. I do believe that parties play a key role in politicizing a new conflict, but in my view, the literature has constantly neglected to analyze popular responses towards top-down politicization efforts. So I tried to include a further compounding element in the notion of politicization, developing a political system notion of politicization, aiming at covering the demand side of politics. In this case, the unit of analysis are the party voter diet. I do consider that voter responses should match the party positioning on the European Union issues, becoming significant electoral determinants. Consequently, the compounding element we should include in the politicization notion is the party voter European Union issue congruence, or for sake of simplicity, EU proximity. My objective was to try to integrate the popular element or the demand side of politics within the notion of politicization by investigating those lay ground people who have not a professional interest in politics, but which are important elements within a political system. Because basically the objective is to cover both the demand side and the supply side of politics. Conflict politicization is about linking the elite policy positions with the broader mass orientations in the political system. So, in trying to covering both the supply side and the demand side of politics, I identified two main party types. On the one hand, we have the mainstream pro-European parties. Those parties are positioned closer to the center of the left-right dimension, and they have traditionally hold positive attitudes towards the European Union issues. These parties are the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, Liberals, Greens. Nonetheless, according to the literature, these parties have mainly tried to silence the European Union issues in order to lock up their electoral fortunes on the traditional conflicts. On the contrary, we have the protest anti-European Union parties, which are those parties positioned towards the extreme poles of the left-right dimension. These parties are radical left and radical right parties. And in order to win more votes, these parties have traditionally tried to mobilize Euroscepticism in order to form a new majority of voters along an alternative European Union dimension of conflict. In this work, my book analyzes strategic incentives and voting patterns associated with each party type. Therefore, in the first empirical step is going to investigate the supply side of politics, that is the party system politicization. I use the issue entrepreneurship notion, which was developed by Catherine De Vries and Sarah Hobbolt. And this definition, this is an index which combines the issue saliency and positional polarization. These are the main compounding elements of a party system politicization. So this index helps us to trace and describe the fluctuations of party strategic efforts on the European Union issues, identifying the party system notion of politicization. And therefore, I advance the two hypotheses, the two first hypotheses of my book, which are the entrepreneurship hypothesis. The first one, hypothesis one, is the protest entrepreneurship hypothesis, and it expects that protest parties have increased the level of European Union issue entrepreneurship in the aftermath of the multiple set of crises. And on the contrary, mainstream parties are expected to decrease the level of European Union issue entrepreneurship. So this is my selection of cases. I chose 9 Western European democracies, and this was based on data availability. 5 non-intervened countries: France, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, and 4 intervened countries: Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. In order to observe the variation in the entrepreneurship, I chose 4 time points: a pre-crisis time point in 2006, 2 onward Euro crisis time points, 2010 and 2014, and a multiple crisis time point in 2017. The dataset I used for developing the index of entrepreneurship is the Chapel Hill Expert Survey. And so the 2006 round is used as the index for determining the increase or decreasing level of entrepreneurship. And these are the first results for the entire Western Europe. The black stands for the protest parties, while the white stands for the mainstream parties. So you can see 2 fundamental trends here. So first and foremost, according to the trend line, the protest entrepreneurship has constantly outweighed the mainstream entrepreneurship on the European Union issues. And to a certain extent, the protest entrepreneurship was already predating the Euro crisis period. So those parties were already substantially committed in politicizing Euroscepticism in the political debate. Nonetheless, in 2014, there was a peak in their issue of in their index of entrepreneurship, and a small decline in the 2017 index. Meantime, we have also another trend for the mainstream parties. Although constantly lagging behind as compared to the protest parties, mainstream parties have gradually responded and increased the level of entrepreneurship. So it's worth to note that mainstream parties are currently more committed to collide over European integration as compared to the past. They have somehow responded towards the Eurosceptic entrepreneurship, further politicizing the European Union conflict in the entire Western Europe. So this is the index for the 9 countries combined together. Then, by disaggregating between intervened countries and non-intervened countries, we have some differentiated patterns. So these are the intervened countries, and we can see that before the Euro crisis, the protest entrepreneurship was kind of moderate. Indeed, those parties have been those party systems are those countries are Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, and usually those countries stood out for a strong Euro enthusiasm, and a strong support for the European integration process. The Euro crisis had a transformative impact, and probably created more incentives to promote a European Union issue entrepreneurship in those countries, especially in driving a Eurosceptic entrepreneurship. We can see that the index among the protest parties boosted in 2014. Nonetheless, also the mainstream parties responded. So also mainstream parties have increasingly emphasized and polarized those issues, politicizing the European Union conflict. The pattern for the non-intervened countries is slightly different. The literature has constantly identified a pattern within those countries. I remind to you that these countries are Sweden, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, France, and Germany. So according to the literature, the sleeping giant of the European integration conflict was already awakened before the Euro crisis. And this is quite visible. This is quite visible because we can see that protest parties in those countries were already committed in politicizing Euroscepticism. Those the notable example of parties such as the UKIP, the National Front, the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, but also some radical left parties. Indeed, we can see that the index was already very strong before the outbreak of the Euro crisis. Nonetheless, an increase of their entrepreneurship took place in 2014. The most important finding about this cluster of countries is the gradual increase of the mainstream pro-European entrepreneurship. Again, we see a common pattern which actually contradicts my hypothesis, but the common pattern is the growing entrepreneurship and the growing politicization efforts among mainstream pro-European parties. So literature on the European Union issue competition did not really expect these growing politicization efforts among pro-European parties. So this is an unexpected result, which is very important for different reasons. So these are the in this table, I try to summarize the findings concerning the two first hypotheses. So there was a pattern of growing issue entrepreneurship in the aftermath of the multiple set of crises, which involved substantially both the protest parties and mainstream parties. So both Eurosceptic and Europhile actors increased their efforts in politicizing this conflict. And while the politicization of the European Union conflict has always been expected as a backlash against the European Union, so with only Eurosceptic mobilizing those issues, having mainstream parties as active entrepreneurs is an important element of a politicization notion. So I was basically able to confirm my first hypothesis, confirming that protest anti-European parties increase the level of European Union issue entrepreneurship. On the contrary, I falsified my hypothesis, my second hypothesis, by observing that the mainstream pro-European parties have increased the level of European Union issue entrepreneurship. Now, let's move to the second part of the empirical analysis, which is advancing several voting models and is analyzing the demand side of politics, that is the political system politicization. I told you, I already mentioned that one further compounding element in the politicization notion is the European Union party voter proximity. So I have measured this notion into a variable, which is the European Union proximity variable, which measures the absolute distance between party positions and voters' self-assessed position on the European Union issues, indicating the voters' congruence, issue congruence, or discrepancy with parties along the European Union issue dimension. So the first hypothesis here is that the impact of the EU proximity is expected to increase as a determinant of electoral preferences. So the expectation is the growth of the political system politicization. And then there are two sub-hypotheses concerning our party types under studies. On the one hand, I expect that protest parties have been more likely to electorally benefit from the European Union proximity issues than the mainstream parties. On the other hand, I expected that mainstream parties have been more likely to electorally benefit from the left-right proximity than the protest parties. I have employed a multi-level regression model to test the connection between the dimensions and of political competition and voting preferences. Here, there are 3 time points: a pre-crisis in 2009, a Euro crisis time point in 2014, and a multiple crisis time point in 2019. So the benchmark to assess whether there is an increase of the European Union proximity variable on the vote, the benchmark is 2009, the pre-crisis coefficient. And in order to understand whether protest parties or mainstream parties have been more likely to benefit from these voting determinants, I included some interaction terms. The science of the interaction terms requires more explanation. Let's say that if the coefficient is positive and significant, the mainstream party type conditionality is met, and therefore mainstream parties are expected to exploit more intensively the voting predictor. On the contrary, when the coefficient is negative and significant, the protest party conditionality is met. These are my control variables: gender, age, education here, trade union membership, unemployment status, party closeness, and finally, the pro-anti-immigration proximity. The pro-anti-immigration proximity is considered here as a proxy of a cultural dimension of contestation. So it is a very important control in my models. And therefore, and then we have the main independent variables. I mean, the left-right proximity variable is the most important heuristic in the political world. And it's very important to control for the resiliency, the resilient impact of this variable. I cannot assess whether the European Union proximity variable has outstripped explanatory power from the left-right proximity, but we can see some concomitant variations in the impact of these variables, which may be interesting to learn. So the dependent variable is the propensity to vote. Although this choice would require some supplemental explanation, I would leave this explanation for the discussion in the aftermath. So the propensity to vote has required as required to reshape the data matrix. And basically, I stacked the data matrix by party, and each individual respondent was multiplied for the number of party under analysis. So here we have the first voting model. I underscore in black the European Union proximity variable in order to show you the fluctuations in the impact of this variable. Now, I'm showing you separate voting models for each time point instead of using a time point variable. To ascertain significant variations of the coefficient. You can see that there is the growing impact of the coefficient. If we look at our benchmark, the 2009, the pre-crisis level, we can see that there is a gradual boost in the impact of this variable on the propensity to vote for parties. Even by plugging a time variable, the increase are significant, are statistically significant. So we can say and we can confirm that there was the growing impact of the European Union proximity on the vote. And so we can assess the growing politicization in the West European of the European Union conflict in West European political system. Although this is not the most surprising result of my work. There are some startling findings which regard the voting patterns of different party types. By looking at the coefficient, at the interaction coefficients, we can see that in 2014, the interaction coefficient was negative. So this basically means that the protest parties were more likely to win over voter preferences along the European Union issue dimension. This is for 2014. So basically what we can say is that Euro crisis probably had a negative impact on public opinion attitudes towards the European Union issues. And protest parties, by means of their Euroscepticism, were able to electorally exploit this popular backlash against the European integration. Nonetheless, the coefficient sign has changed in 2019. And this basically means that the mainstream pro-European parties have become more likely to win over votes along the European Union issue dimension. I really did not expect this change in pattern. So by refuting my own hypothesis and showing that Europhilia was more electorally profitable, I was a little bit puzzled myself, because this is against all the backdrops on the European Union issue competition. So basically, all the background literature maintain that pro-European parties are weaker along this issue, are electorally weaker along this issue dimension. Instead, we can see the change of the sign. And this means basically that Europhilia is an important electoral asset for the pro-European parties, while on the contrary, Eurosceptic parties do not primarily rely on their Euroscepticism, but they rely on other kind of messages. And the second finding of this model is also quite surprising, because it shows us, by interacting protest party type with left-right distance, we can see that protest Eurosceptic parties have become more likely to win over votes along the left-right issue dimension as compared to the mainstream pro-European parties. Again, this is confirming the backdrop literature. According to the backdrop literature, protest parties were holding, the mainstream parties were holding the pride, were dominating the traditional left-right dimension. They were winning more votes along this dimension, and they wanted to maintain this dimensionality of political contestation by dismissing the European Union conflict. I don't know, these findings honestly have surprised me, and also went very much against all the literature backdrop that I accumulated, that I developed in the first chapters of my book. But nonetheless, non-intervened countries, I don't want to make many more remarks about the single country clusters. I want just to say that there are similar patterns. So we can see that mainstream parties have become more likely to win votes along the European Union issue dimension, while the protest parties have become more likely to win votes along the left-right issue dimension as compared to their counterparts. The most important finding concerning, another important finding concerning the non-intervened countries, so remember Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, is that the European Union issue proximity has gained a very, very significant impact over time, and now it's a very robust heuristic among the voters. It is basically constituting a dimension of its own, and the increase was very important, the increase in the impact of the European Union proximity on the vote. Quite on the contrary, and this is not totally unexpected, this variable is still less powerful among the intervened countries. The intervened countries are Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Nonetheless, there was a significant increase in the impact of the European Union proximity variable over time. And the literature has always considered the south of Europe as being more dominated by the economic conflict, and basically there was a resiliency in the class conflict or the religious conflict. According to Carrieri, those countries were reflecting a much Rockanian system of cleavages, while the cultural dimension of contestation, the new issues such as European integration, migration, were not powerful drivers. In here we can see that the pro-anti-European Union distance has increased its impact on the vote. And especially we can see how much migration policies are important drivers in those countries. Before the Euro crisis, this migration proximity variable had no impact at all on the vote. So we can see that there is a growing homogeneity between the two country groups. I never said or advanced the hypothesis that those country groups can be considered as being equals. There are important differences, but I do believe that the multiple set of crises actually set in motion more political convergence between these two country groups. So in order just to conclude, basically, we can see a growing politicization of this conflict, both at the party system level and at the political system level. There was a pattern where parties increasingly emphasized and polarized the European Union issues in the political debate. And this pattern involved both protest parties and mainstream parties. So voters received cues both from Europhile and Eurosceptic parties, and these contributed not to create a limited politicization of the European Union conflict, with only Eurosceptic attitudes being present, but also Europhile attitudes were spread, probably producing a mobilization, an electoral mobilization of the Europhile voters. And so consistently, we also saw an increasing impact of the European Union proximity variable on the vote, with voters increasingly matching party positions along this issue dimension. I can speculate on the impact of this crisis, although I cannot advance causal inference between the outbreak of this crisis, but I can only raise a well-reasoned speculation. So, and I'm very glad that here we have people who were involved in the EU Engage project, because by using some data of the EU Engage project, some scholars such as Niccolò Conti, Vincenzo Memoli, showed us that in the aftermath of the migration crisis, attitudes towards the European Union did not necessarily worsen, but on the contrary, many citizens, both in entry countries and destination countries, reappraised basically had positive attitudes towards European Union migration policies, perceiving the European Union level as the most adequate one to address the emergence of the refugees in Europe. Furthermore, and I do consider this as being the most important catalyst for a Europhile backlash, the reality of the British withdrawal from the European Union has probably magnified the existing benefits over the cost, with many citizens reappraising their country's membership in the European Union. I don't have evidence about this trend, but the literature is increasingly providing evidence about the drop in the support for leaving the European Union as a consequence of the Brexit referendum in the rest of Europe. So we can say that, quite contrary to the Euro crisis, the refugee crisis and the Brexit have not actually triggered a worsening in individual opinions on the European integration. So this is basically the last slide. Scholars have recurrently qualified the European Union politicization process as a Eurosceptic backlash. I think many scholars underestimated the importance of Europhilia. Because pro-European Europhilia in general is a fundamental parcel of a fully fledged conflict. And it fundamentally contributed to awaken the sleeping giant of this conflict. A conflict, at the end, a conflict is about having two opposing and diverging camps which are colliding over different positions. So basically, the Europhile entrepreneurship had a fundamental role in politicizing this conflict, with voters being more strongly aligned along a European Union issue dimension. And there is also another pattern which concerned the protest parties, which had not primarily relied on the electoral support of Eurosceptic voters, probably profiling themselves as catch-all parties. A new avenue of research may identify and study which kind of issues were more important to determine the electoral support of this cluster of parties. So basically, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luca, for your presentation. I'm sure we have comments and questions and observations, and in general, I think it's an issue that stimulates the debate. So I'm going to open up the floor for a first round of questions. If anybody has anything to ask or observe. Paolo, you raised your hand, so please.
First of all, hello, Luca, and congratulations on your publication.
Thank you very much, Paolo.
Milan is quite a feat, so congratulations. It is interesting to see, while I was watching your figures about the issue entrepreneurship from 2009, 2010, 2014, 2017, it was interesting to see how the pattern for Eurosceptic protest Eurosceptic parties matched my results from my thesis on the meta-analysis of Eurosceptic parties, because I saw a spike in Eurosceptic party presence in national legislature from 2011 to 2015 and from 1996 up to 2004. So it was interesting to see how the periods in which the issue entrepreneurship for Eurosceptic parties was lower, especially in the same time where there were less Eurosceptic parties in national legislatures. So this brings me to believe that there is indeed an underlying pattern concerning what Hatter and Grande called the politicizing moments of integration. Basically, my questions are not really criticism, because I don't see the point for that. More, let's say, curious potential pathways for new research. The first one is about the direction of the issue entrepreneurship. So it will be interesting to see, perhaps you have used the Chapel Expert Survey, and of course it's very important. I also use it. It will be interesting to see whether or not the issue entrepreneurship is positive or negative towards Europe. I'm thinking mostly about Meyer's paper on the contagion effect of Eurosceptic parties on non-Eurosceptic formations. So to see whether or not the crisis had an impact on the way in which non-Eurosceptic parties perceive the issue of the European Union. So was there perhaps an increase in the negative coverage, because as we both know, being an Eurosceptic party doesn't mean that you always brag against the European Union, and being a Europhiliac party doesn't mean that you always strive to push for further integration. So this perhaps, and I was thinking perhaps the Comparative Manifesto project might be a source for effectively analyzing the direction of this pattern. And of course, I do have to ask the stupid, idiotic methodological question that every Eurosceptic researcher asks, which is, how did you manage to separate Eurosceptic from non-Eurosceptic parties? I assume it was 4 or lower on the chess score, but I don't want to speculate. And last thing, I don't think that the rejection of your hypothesis is a negative factor per se, because if I remember correctly, Teresa Kuhn, in a recent paper, I think 2019, said that non-Eurosceptic parties were forced to take an issue on the European question or the European topic because of the demands of the rising demands of the public opinion, which is consistent with the constraining dissensus theory. So, of course, in literature, you can spin scholars more or less differently, but perhaps an interpretation of the rejection of your hypothesis might be that there are certain politicizing factors in spite of the ever-growing presence of the European Union, and the Eurosceptic parties are simply more able or more capable to politicize the issue at certain points in time, and then, for example, after 2016, the issue is not salient or that salient anymore, so you can see a difference in their behavior. And I'm done.
Thank you, Paolo. Do we have other questions? We might collect a few of them together, if that's the case. Paolo.
Yes. Thanks, Luca. Thanks for your interesting presentation. Thanks for having shared with us your book, which has been very generous of you, and I will read it carefully because because what you said triggered my interest and attention. Let me say that, first of all, I think you have a good story here. So it's a good story in the sense that we as a group, the scholarly attention is more attracted to Euroscepticism rather than towards Europhilia. And so you are basically upending the general argument. You are basically following the idea that Europe, the European Union, will evolve during exceptional crisis, which was one of the founding fathers' perspective, Jean Monnet. Okay, so my reading of what I haven't read, of course, your book, but I carefully followed your presentation, and my reading of this is that basically the crises have acted as a kind of sorting factor, making also mainstream parties, which were traditionally silent, forcing them to speak up. And this as reflected upon the voters, and the voters found a clearer, let's say, choice to make. And I think this is a good point. And I have only a few, so far, only a few interests, let's say, doubts, which one of these has been already raised by Paolo Marzi, because you have shown the change in the entrepreneurship, which I translate into saliency, even though I understand that there is more than salience. There is also in your measure some kind of conflict. But And that salience, those indexes, measure the amount of voice upon by the parties, but do not tell, if I understand correctly, the direction. So your data do not show that the mainstream parties spoke up in favor of EU. They could have spoken also against EU, criticizing the way EU has acted during this crisis. So this is just one curiosity. The second and last curiosity is that your interaction effect, which is the key point, no? Basically, what that coefficient tells us is that voters for parties which were perceived, which were, as also Paolo said, attributed to you into one of the two camps in favor or against, mainstream or protest, they voted along that dimension. Basically, being on one side of the camp made it clear how to vote. This is what I understood. And I'm wondering whether you also have other instruments, other tools to make this clearer, because just relying on these interaction terms is a little bit difficult to comprehend what you are aimed at. These are just two curiosities, but thanks for your very interesting work.
Thank you, Paolo, to both Paolos. And I think if we have no further question at the moment, Luca, you already have a lot on your plate, yeah. So I will let you answer.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Paolo Marsi. I'm glad to see you again. And yes, I'm happy that this more or less the results of my analysis are coinciding with your meta-analysis, and I am actually curious to read your work. If you are willing to share with me, I will be happy about that. Okay, the directions. This is tackles both. Questions from Professor Bellucci and also from Paolo Marsi. I mean, there is negative. The issue entrepreneurship index can have negative and positive sign, but nonetheless, it fails in understanding. It fails in capturing a proper Europhilia or a proper Euroscepticism. So what I did was to control party Euroscepticism and party Europhilia by splitting into Eurosceptic versus Europhile. And just compare the entity, but not the direction, because the direction is too problematic. The sign of this entrepreneurship index is too much problematic. It's not capturing party-based Euroscepticism or party-based Europhilia. And in order to categorize Euroscepticism or Europhilia, that's, I mean, you have to advance this kind of curiosity that is compulsory. Yes, I rely on a threshold from the Chapel Hill. But in some cases, when the literature was providing evidence of a more Eurosceptic party, even for instance, there was Podemos, who did not fully match, was a little bit, had a position of 4 and not 3.5. I relied on the literature in that case. On some cases, I located some case on the Eurosceptic cluster by relying on the literature. General rule of thumb was to rely on this threshold, which is used in the literature. Those having a position from 0 to 3.5 are Eurosceptic. I also tried to locate Podemos and other parties on the Europhile camp, but the results are not changing, are not notably changing. Professor Bellucci, really I'm flattered that you think that here we have a story. You have to understand that basically, so what I already said to Paolo, the direction of Euroscepticism, the direction of the entrepreneurship is not really helping us to capture the party ideology. So I only compare the entity. What else? You have to understand that here I moved from a literature background which was very convinced about several, let's say, assumptions that mainstream parties did not have incentives to politicize this conflict. Even if was there, we can say that, of course, if the Eurosceptic parties are going to increase the entrepreneurship and are going to speak up about Europe, at a certain point, we should expect a reaction from the counterpart. Other literature streams, for instance, on the immigration issues, on the welfare issues, had identified this kind of patterns where when one actor politicized the issue and the issue became relevant in the party system, all the other parties should talk about that. It's it's not really a zero-sum game. And but I think the literature on the European Union issue competition was a little bit blind about that, was too much relying on the William Riker assumption, according to which one party try to activate a new issue dimension and other parties blur the issue dimension. This was not the case. About the last interesting comment or actually question that Professor Bellucci asked me, how to improve the information and how to better control for party ideology. I mean, I have also some scatter plots in the book which help the readership. Nonetheless, I'm really willing to accept some advice and suggestions from all of you in order to improve the quality of my work, because I'm still trying to improve and really try to disseminate other short articles improving these models. So if Professor Bellucci, if you have some suggestions in how to strengthen the party ideology control, I would be very willing to accept that, really, seriously. Thank you for the comments from both of you, by the way.
Thank you, Luca, for your replies. I have a raised hand by Sabrina. So, Sabrina, please.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Well, just, I mean, following this direction in terms of questions, my specific point for Luca, even in perspective, is the following. If you don't think that in order to unpack the notion of EU politicization if it is not the case to start to unpack the concept of EU issue, in a sense that, I mean, again, we are talking about EU support, skepticism versus Europhilia. And I think that, I mean, my question for you is if at this time won't be the case to enter a little bit even the concept of EU entrepreneurship by focusing a little bit more on EU issues, that is turning from singular to plural. Because, I mean, it seems that there's room for maneuver even to go ahead in the research agenda about politicizing which objects. I mean, we are still talking about a support or an opposition vis-a-vis the system as such, but we know there's something about sectoral opposition, sectoral support, and I mean, this is a point that, I mean, in perspective, it could be, in my view, very, very crucial to stress more, even in our research. So I would like to know what you think about this.
Can I take this immediately? Because I would like to follow up to Sabrina's comment. Sabrina, I agree 100% with you. I mean, this is trying to unpack the European Union dimension, identifying which are the important issues. Let's say that my research was about the European Union polity issue. Let's say this. Why it's important to unpack the European Union dimension. In another work that I just published, I tried to identify the impact of the European Union budgetary issues on the vote. So Mattia also know this work because he was my discussant in the CISP conference when I presented this article. So I do really believe there is room of maneuvering for improving research on the European Union politicization. And here we have people and also researchers that try to promote this kind of research also by means of the European Union Engage project, which was in this direction. Unfortunately, I'm telling you, the European election studies, the survey which I'm exploiting and which allow me to compare all these countries, just take away some important issues concerning the policy. There was an important question on what do you think about what do you think about the transfer of budgetary and economic prerogatives towards the European Union? I wrote an article about that, but I had only one time point because they took away from the survey. I mean, we are dealing with a lot of scarcity of sources about this, especially in the realm of the electoral studies. Sorry if I break into like that.
No problem. Do we have other questions? I actually would like to ask a couple of questions which are maybe less up to the point than the ones that preceded, because I'm not an expert of electoral studies, so I apologize in advance if my questions sound naive. My first question is the following. you start by presenting a sort of dichotomy between two types of parties, mainstream pro-EU parties and protest anti-EU parties. Is this distinction an assumption or something that you test in the end? So this partially connects to what Paolo said. Can we assume that parties which are located at the center in the left-right dimension are consistently more pro-EU than countries at the extreme? I think this is the case, but I wanted to know if this is something that you just assume and don't test or check empirically, or if there is also some empirical check. And the second point is more about the terminology that you use. I'm referring to the definition of intervened countries. Again, in this group of countries, we have both countries which signed a memorandum of understanding, and a very tough one. I think Greece signed 3, not just one. Then you have Portugal, which also had a memorandum of understanding. You have Spain, which didn't have a proper memorandum of understanding, at least not in the way the other two countries had. It just had a loan from the European stability mechanism for rescuing a couple of banks. And Italy, which didn't have any formal intervention. So again, I see that these countries all went through similar things, but I was wondering if, first of all, we can just assume that they experienced the same in the Euro crisis, or it's something that we should test and check empirically. And second, if there is another way to define what these countries went through. And I think I stop here, and I congratulate again on your research, because it's very thought-provoking. Very last point, since I'm here, I think the news that there is increased politicization on EU issues is very good news, because I mean, when I was doing my PhD more than 10 years ago, and I read Mayer, and I mean, Mayer was complaining exactly about the fact that nobody cared about the EU, and this made EU politics so weak. So if there is increasing politicization, it means that finally, on the one hand, the EU matters more, and that national party systems finally are taking an interest in this. So I think this is definitely good news, and it's good that you are showing us. Thank you.
Mattia, you basically address my biggest regret about this book. So the party typology, because I really, if I had to write this again, I would really relinquish this party typology, because I try to integrate two dimensions, both the positions of parties along the European Union dimension and their location within party families, which was an hard job. And somehow I did assume some positional inflexibility of parties along the European Union dimension, which was a mistake, because I relied very much on the literature, because this was what the literature said. Hugo Marx published a lot on this and said that political parties do not change their position. They are quite inflexible. They relied on the Chapel Hill expert dataset, and so they had empirical ground for saying that. Of course, I used the 2017 empirical round of the Chapel Hill. But now, really, for instance, the assumption was party on the extremes, radical right and radical left, were more likely to be Eurosceptic. Now, and today, we know that radical left parties are relinquishing and abandoning the Eurosceptic camp. So with some foresight, I should not have adopted this typology. This typology was really, I don't know, my blind reviewer liked the typology. So I was encouraged to some extent. But was really the outcome of my PhD. And I have to say that this electoral volatility we are facing at the time of my PhD, which was about 2015, 2018, this typology seemed fit to describe the cleavage over Europe, over the European integration. Now, I'm writing new works on this, and I completely dismiss my former typology. I'm only using a distinction between pro-EU and anti-EU, without trying to integrate the dimension of the party families. So this is one of the regrets I have about this book. But nonetheless, on the non-intervene countries, there is a long section of the book where I explain the difference. So this was another suggestion from the blind reviewers of this book, which suggested to me to integrate this distinction, which is a distinction that was promoted by Sonia Alonso and Ruiz Rufino, who made many publications about this distinction and basically included Italy and Spain into the cluster of the intervene countries because they committed themselves with the European Union to implement some policies, some cutbacks, and some kind of policies. This was their kind of argument. Although there was, of course, a distinction between those countries which undergone a direct intervention from the Troika. So. But nonetheless, those scholars included those countries in the same cluster. I don't know whether there is a better way to tackle the different impact of those crises, of this crisis in Europe, because this is very controversial. To some extent, let me say that this was useful to me, this kind of distinction, because it helps me to cover and insulate South of Europe from the rest. But this is not a good explanation. This is not a good explanation. I don't know. I know that this is really controversial. I had a lot of discussion about this distinction, but this Alonso and Ruiz Rufino typology of non-intervene versus intervene countries is kind of accepted. So, no, and was also requested by the reviewers.
Thank you, Luca. I make a last call for last questions that might still be out there, and give everybody a few seconds to think. All right. I don't see any raised hands. Nobody's asking to ask new questions. So I guess we came to an end of this seminar, and we can conclude. On behalf of all of us, let me thank you again, because it was a very nice. It's a nice piece of research, your book, and it was a very good presentation, and it was very useful, especially for people like me who are less into this debate. So thank you, Luca, again for presenting your book. Thanks to all the participants for listening and intervening, and we will see each other again next week. We have another Tuesday seminar at 11 a.m. in the morning with a presentation by Marcin Grabowski of the Krakow University about an analysis of the Sino-American relations at the term of Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So to everybody, I will see you next week. And thank you, Luca, again, and thank you all of you for participating. Goodbye.
Thank you for attending.
And a welcome to Luca, who will join the CIRCAP soon. And also a special thank and very happy to see Jim Newell after a long time. Special guest of the CIRCAP seminar.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here, and I'm very enthralled by your presentation, Luca. It was very interesting. So thank you very much indeed. I shall certainly buy your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Grazie Mattia.